I get this out of the way here. Let me scroll that down. Boom. All right. Good evening. Welcome to Library Issues Today. I am your host, Christopher Fleming, and I have along with me two other MLIS candidates. We have Anntwanette Sulton and Gardner from the University of South Carolina. Today, we're going to speak on post-war work, library activism through the 1950s and 60s. We're going to focus on activism through literature and activism through direct action and protest. We're going to open up with Anntwanette on activism through literature.
Hello. Wayne and Shirley Wigand are two influential library and information science professionals who have dedicated their life to researching the history of Southern public libraries, honing in on how neutral libraries and the American Library Association attempted to be in the 1950s and 60s. And the information and dates that I will be presenting to you come from two of their works that I focused on. This neutrality didn't come without pushback, especially from Black librarians and advocates. Although their works in large discuss everything that the American Library Association didn't do when it came to desegregating libraries, particularly in the South, a lot of what ALA did do and what I will hone in on is how they eventually had to acknowledge segregation in the South. And they did this through a direct response of library activism efforts by Black librarians and those who advocated against segregation. Analyzing ALA during this time period is important because they were and are one of the largest associations that impact and influence libraries. One form of activism during this time period that was directly mentioned several times was activism through the implementation of literature, such as editorials and letters. And I'll be honing in on three of what I felt were some of the most impactful pieces and authors. So Eric Moon, featured in the picture on the right, was the editor of the Library Journal during a large portion of the late 1950s and 60s. I would also note, after finishing out that position in the late 1970s, he became the ALA president. During the 1950s and 60s, the Library Journal, just like the Wilson Bulletin featured in the center, was not a direct voice of ALA, so they could voice their political and social opinions more freely than literature under the umbrella of ALA. And they were often attacked by ALA for their outspoken publications. One of the published editorials that Moon highlighted in the Library Journal in a December 1960 edition was a piece by Rice Estes. Estes largely critiqued the issue that ALA deemed library integration and education of African Americans as a local issue and chose to remain neutral and out of the conversations. A powerful statement he made within this work, and I'm paraphrasing a good portion, but he said, the term local is never defined, but yet some librarians are ready to organize a book campaign for Ghana, but when African Americans are denied services in their hometowns, Black people were left without a librarian's voice lifted in their behalf. And wow, just let that quote sink in. I would also point out, ironically, many said integration was a local issue, especially ALA, they said that often. However, this was yet a case that went all the way up through the Supreme Court via Brown versus Board. And now I'm going to shift into the middle context here. John Wakeman, a Wilson Library Bulletin editor, also wrote a piece in 1960 prior to the Library Journal's December publication. His editorial pushed the narrative that ALA was not neutral. They had chosen a side based on their actions of the first integrated conference in 1956 at Miami Beach, and ALA developing a policy that stated only one association per state could be represented in ALA, and they had to accept all members regardless of race. Both of these articles sparked conversation throughout the field and made integration a topic that could not be ignored, especially because these conversations came from professionals within the field. I also want to hone in on Miss Virginia Lacey Jones on the left, an Atlanta University library dean, who was also notable during this time period because she encouraged her students to act by writing theses on racist issues in public libraries in the South, especially after Brown versus Board was overturned. Although her students' publications largely stayed local, she still promoted activism through literature for young library professionals of color, and those theses were referred by Ms. Jones when she would later be one of the three Black librarians who spoke in the December 1963 Library Journal Forum. Ms. Jones was also vocal in a Wilson Library Bulletin that highlighted Black librarians' voices on the subject, where she stated, and I quote, "Conditions cannot improve until ALA takes strong actions to present itself as a model in democratic practices and until the leader in the profession can do likewise." Next slide, please. So, why does any of this matter? My argument is not only that literature was a vital part of activism in the 1950s and 60s, but library literature activism in particular made a difference for the profession due to impact. The four names listed on the previous slides, of course, were not the only writers of their time. However, they wrote some pieces that were well circulated throughout the profession and that I could find information on. Because I will note, when I did my research, a lot of texts pertaining to integration, they mentioned did not get recorded or passed down. And possibly I saw this largely being because newspapers were a large form of communication for the time, and of light of white-owned newspapers were not going to publish pieces from Black librarians or advocates in support of integration. And that was just the reality of the time period mimicking the dominant voice and culture. However, through these publications, these were some of the first times that ALA and the profession could not deny what was going on with segregation and how it was hindering minority communities and minority librarians, especially in the South. Overall, these publications kept the conversation of integration and segregation at the forefront of not only ALA, but the library professionals in general by calling out injustices. Black librarians and advocates understood the importance of integrated libraries and were not going to back down. Although the article did not directly align the publications with impacts through reflection of the events mentioned in the article, I aligned them with several impacts/outcomes and created this timeline accordingly, which spans over the course of 10 years between Brown versus Board and Congress passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Some notable impacts that this library literature had, and so many more within this time period I'll just be highlighting a few that I haven't already mentioned. So in 1958, the subject heading Segregation in the Library appeared in the Library Literature Index. In 1960, the Civil Rights Committee was formed by ALA. In 1961, the Civil Rights Committee added to the Library Bill of Rights the rights of an individual to the use of a library should not be denied or abridged because of his race, religion, national origin, or political views. Without publications sparking conversations, these committees, surveys, and additions to text would not have occurred. You can see the increase in conversation within the library profession after publications such as Moon, Estes, Wakeman, and Jones were written and discussed, which is shown in red between 1961 to 1963. The segregation in the library was cited in 56 articles. Finally, I would like to mention after the 1964 Civil Rights Act in 1966, all Southern state library associations were integrated.
Great job, Anntwanette. I just saw this quote when doing my research and thought it was fitting for our presentation. This is John Oliver Killians. He was an African-American writer from Georgia who wrote novels featuring African-American life. In this undated quote, he states, "Integration begins the day after the minds of the people are desegregated." I find this quote very profound. I believe that a lot of the mindset of people who were against desegregation were comfortable in their embracement of the Jim Crow laws that were designed to segregate Black and white people from one another. Killian was famous for quotes, in-your-face quotes like this. Next slide.
All right, so it's on me now?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. So the topic that I'm going to delve into is a topic that a lot of people, no matter how significant this period was, not many people actually know about, and it's called the Freedom Libraries. Before we go into that, I would like to read this quote from Henry Berry, a slave owner. "We have, as far as possible, closed every avenue by which the light may enter the slave's mind. If we could extinguish the capacity to see light, our work will be complete. They would then be on the level of the beast of the fields, and we then should be safe."
And Christopher, I did want to comment really quick before you moved on, just
Sure.
on the picture. And I really like that you included this photo. I also wanted to note that our activism as a group holistically seemed to focus on the South, but this was happening nationally, and the South may have been an impactful area for libraries because after slavery, a large portion of African Americans stayed in the South. One of the sources I read indicated that literacy grew for African Americans from 20 to 60% after slavery. And as more wanted to become educated and literate, and that's why Freedom Libraries play such a vital role in the 60s, especially in this time period when some public libraries were still segregated, as I mentioned, and the resources that they offered were not up to par, especially in comparison to white libraries.
Absolutely. And it got to the point where when they did local histories on the people, they actually preferred the freedom libraries, no matter how dilapidated the building may be, no matter how not up to par even those buildings were. They just loved the way that they was treated there versus the state-sponsored libraries. So it became an actual integral part of the community itself. And, you know, that's something to be commended in such a tumultuous time in American history. But yeah, the inequality and the racist acts of the American system has its foundation in this quote from Henry Berry, a slave owner from 1832. There was and is a concerted effort to keep African Americans ignorant on the level of beasts to keep the so-called dominant structure in place. For those systems to power, for these systems of power to be, someone must be on the bottom of the totem pole. Someone must play the role of the docile, go along to get along, reinforcers of the status quo. But this isn't one of those stories. This is a story of revolutionary action against the status quo, performed by revolutionary African Americans and white folks alike, who looked at the current paradigm and said, no, that's wrong, and I'm going to do something about it. College students dedicated their summers to face immeasurable racist and violent odds. Some would not even return for school that next semester because their soul met heaven while trying to bring heaven to the pits of hell that they were currently visiting. There's another book that you might have heard of called The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, but allow me to introduce you to those badass librarians of the Freedom Libraries of 1964. The Freedom Libraries were originally a product of the Freedom Summer, a voting registration campaign launched by various civil rights organizations in Mississippi during the summer of 1964. Although there was bloodshed, death threats, attempts, and bombings of these libraries, little is known about them. 5 decades of civil rights literature barely mentions them, while histories of the American libraries ignore them altogether. But the Freedom Libraries were an integral part of the civil rights movement. Each civil rights headquarters housed a library, which was used by students, parents, and teachers. The Freedom Libraries. The revolutionaries of the Freedom Libraries understood that voting was only part of the solution towards equality, and that education was always a primary key to be attained to reach freedom. The Southern mind needed to be expanded to see itself beyond the images that was always sold to them. So the subjects requested from the Freedom Libraries were books on Negro history and books by Negro authors. The ones that were the most popular were James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time and a few of his other books. And another one that was most popular was Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. They got a lot of books from universities and that were that were based on philosophy for those kind of courses. And there was also a lot of books from the English department. So it wasn't just academic textbooks. There was also a lot of novels, autobiographies, and things that people would probably read while they were in college. The Freedom Libraries were run by volunteers, teachers, and beginning librarians that had not either finished school yet or just completed their studies. But perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was getting books into the hands of the community. Virginia Steele is a name most associated with the Freedom Libraries. She did more to organize, streamline, and project a semblance of shared practices to the project. But when the responsibilities was placed on her, she was quoted by saying she wanted to die when it came to the prospect of Freedom Libraries in the pits of racial hatred. The mountain was something that she almost couldn't bear until she met a group of African-American students at Stanford University that told them of their experience of children listening to Dr. Seuss stories and that they'd never heard anything like that before. And that might have been the catalyst that caused Steele to join the Summer Project. The pain grows worse with each bombing. The white backlash. There were many ways that the ambitions of the Freedom Libraries were attempted to be thwarted by racists. One problem is that none of the Freedom Librarians owned any of the buildings that they attempted to bring the Freedom Libraries in. So the buildings would often be described as decrepit, filthy, and probably unsafe. And these buildings that the Freedom Librarians had to rent were overpriced, and then they had to rehab the buildings that they was being overcharged for. It was the morning of July 8th, 1964, when the Macomb house was bombed. A bundle of dynamite had been placed outside an open window. Curtis Hayes, one of 10 people sleeping inside the Freedom House at the time, was severely lacerated by shards of window glass. There were a total of 35 shootings, 80 beatings, and 65 bombings that summer against people who simply wanted to access the library, be it by state or their own accord.
And Christopher, if you could go back really quick, I just thought, as you were talking, one of the points that my articles kept bringing up was the fact that African Americans were segregated libraries that weren't always well, for mine, we're not always in the best condition when it came to public libraries, but you also mentioned freedom libraries. And it's amazing to me how African Americans, their taxpayer dollars were going toward these buildings that were not even up to standard, that they couldn't even enter. That is just mind blowing to me as you talked about those conditions. And I think about the conditions of public libraries for African Americans during that time. So I just really wanted to make that point that that's just wow.
Yeah, that's very wild. And you know, those African American libraries were so underserved, and the Freedom Libraries ended up having better books than the libraries themselves. They created a pipeline from our brothers up north that they would donate books down to the South to replenish our libraries. One library in Vicksburg actually got burned down to the ground. And they use that as a marketing tool, says for a book swap. So to my people up north, if you give us a new replacement book, we'll give you an artifact of this library that was burnt down. And that's how they replenished everything from there.
So, and piggybacking on that what you just said, Christopher and Anntwanette, we do have a troubled history of U.S. public libraries. This is something that was kind of shocking to me as I was diving in doing the research. The silent clip you're looking at right now is from Albany, Georgia, and it's showing African American students being turned away from using the Albany Carnegie Library. Rather than integrate the actual library, the city commission decided to close the branch in order not to comply. And so after some public outcry, the library did eventually reopen a year later in 1963, but they removed all the seating for patrons. So I find that mind blowing. Like, what purpose was that? Like, we'll open it, but we're going to strip it down and make it where it's very unuseful. So I found this. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you go ahead. No, I'm sorry. I'm so excited to talk.
Yeah. So this was one of the resources that I found insightful from the Digital Public Library of America. This website, I discovered a wealth of information and real artifacts from the segregation of libraries and the desegregation movement after Brown Bors's Board of Education in '54. So even though Supreme Court's decision to overturn separate but equal, the real change seemed to stall for years to come, especially in the South. It was super surprising for me to see how much resistance existed and the mass efforts by some to prevent access to public facilities across the U.S., especially in the South. Some of the earliest public libraries in the southern states excluded African Americans by law. So I felt like it was very troubling and disheartening to learn that. And Anntwanette,
yes. Sorry, what I was trying to interrupt you and say. I'm so sorry.
I know you had said yes. I'm sorry.
Don, I thought it was really interesting that you showed the clip and you mentioned Georgia, because Mississippi and Georgia, as I was doing my own research, were two of the state associations that refused membership to Black librarians, and therefore, after ALA changed their policy, they actually lost their ALA representation. So just like they would rather shut it down, they also chose to lose their ALA membership as well. And again, that's just wow.
I found
extent
that
that some people
super
go to.
ironic. Like it's crazy. Like instead of complying and opening up to everybody, they just went ahead and shut it down.
Racism is real. The extent that people will go
Yes,
to is
The
wow.
extent
Just
people
wow.
will go to. Yeah.
that's the sad fact. Next slide, please. So this was a photograph that I found from the Southern Services for African Americans, and I found out in 1946, just under 1/3 of the public library systems in the U.S. South reported some form of service to African Americans. 188 of 597 total libraries, making library service available to about 34.2% of Black population of these states, who, again, as y'all said, were paying taxes, but yet they couldn't use the facilities. Although many activists challenged segregation laws through writings and individual action, it was not until the actual civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that segregated public libraries would be challenged through coordinated nonviolent protests and actions. It's when
And
I know
Don,
you had said, I thought you had said you wanted to say something.
I did, yes. Again, so I'm going to comment on what you just said, Don, and I think that's an important aspect to consider. Literature and publications, such as I discussed, are great and impactful. However, the downside is they often take a while to be disseminated, especially during this time period because there was a lack of technology. Although through research, I was reminded that publications are a form of direct communication, and that can also be lost or go missing quite literally. Protests, on the other hand, are an immediate response and reflect an immediate reaction. Responders to the literature of this time, such as ALA, had a chance to digest and think about what they wanted to say, or even had the ability not to respond at all. But this isn't always possible with protests. So I think that was a very interesting connection I made between the protest and the direct action that you all talked about versus the library literature activism that I talked about.
Excellent. I'm really getting a lot out of our conversation. Next slide, please. So this, I feel like I could do a whole presentation on this one piece. This, you're looking at a picture of one of the Tougaloo Nine. Her name is Ethel Sawyer, and she was arrested for a sit-in at a public library. She's one of the Tougaloo Nine, and she attempted her crime trying to go to the library, to a white library, to actually read books. She's one of many activists who challenged segregation laws through individual actions and writings. It was not until the actual civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s that segregated public libraries would be challenged through coordinated nonviolent protest action. Jackson State, she attended Jackson State, and she was one of the Tougaloo Nine, and so all those 9 people got arrested during a sit-in at a white-only library. The NAACP's Youth Council, she was part of that. Later that day, students from Jackson State College quickly organized a prayer vigil in support of the Tougaloo Nine, which had hundreds of participants. So all they were doing was gathering to pray. The university ended up breaking that up. They were supported by the city police and threatened to jail all those as well. The 3 organizers of the prayer vigil to support the Tougaloo Nine were expelled from Jackson City College. When word started to get out about what happened, other students started boycotting class and marching to the jail where the Tougaloo Nine were being held in custody. Each student was sentenced to 30 days in jail and given a fine of $100. These actions led to the NAACP filing a class action lawsuit against the Jackson Public Library because of the integration practices. In 1962, it took District Court Judge William Harold Cox to order the public library to desegregate. This was seen as one of the big victories and one of the first victories to desegregate in the 60s because of the Civil Rights Campaign. Although a lot of people chose to ignore this decision, it took for years to come for it to actually take place.
Man, as I sit and think about our conversation here, you know, from 1950 until now, that's what, about 73 years worth of history. And, you know, a lot of things that come to my mind is how much has really changed and how much has really stayed the same. Because it seems like, this is my son, y'all. He can't help but be a star in one of these Zooms here. It seems like
It's about him. It's about
right.
yeah, it is.
You know, with the library issues, you can take out rape and then put in transgender issues, or you can take out transgender issues and put in sexist issues. You can take out, you know, say it's like all of these issues that we're dealing with are almost interchangeable. It's like everybody has a turn to be the one that takes the most burden of the issues that's going on at the time. So, you know, I guess as a conclusion for us as the next wave of librarians that are coming into the system, what are we going to do that's going to be different? You know, I'm pretty sure everybody before us said this is where the buck ends, this is where it stops. But it seems like the problems find themselves multiplying no matter what the decade is. And this isn't a question that I want all of us to answer right now. But I think this is something that we should all think about as we continue our journey and getting our MLIS and realizing that it's more than just a piece of paper. It's more than just theory that's being studied. It's more than just words that are on a page. This is real life. This is real life experiences that people are having, and we are placed in the middle of that community as a ways to alleviate some of that drama that happens every day. So from post-war activism from the 50s and 60s till now, all I can say is, I guess the struggle continues. All right, it seemed like we had some technical difficulties. Dawn, are you still there?
Yeah, I am.
Sweet. But yeah, so like I was saying is, you know, with the burden of everything that's going on, it still seems like the struggle continues, you know?
And it's interesting that you say that, Christopher, because the two sources that I analyzed from the Wagans, one quote that he actually had at the end of a chapter for our time period, the 1950s and 60s, and I'll quote the author. He said, "Few librarians were ready to put their lives on the line for the cause. Few had suffered Jim Crow humiliations as a routine way of life, walked up public library steps through hostile white crowds carrying bats and clubs, sat in libraries before the eyes of angry white librarians and their white patrons, or were arrested on sight, only to be walked back through and occasionally beaten by the same crowds, then carted off to jail, where if the history they knew was any teacher, they were easy prey for lynch mobs." And I end quote. And again, that was from the author. I kind of just brought that up to say, we discussed the library activism and everything that was going on at the time. However, there were a lot of individuals who weren't being active, and more so, I love the activism for the time period, but I guess in conversation and discussion, I think our group came to also realize as we were finding this information in these sources, a lot of people remain neutral, such as ALA. They remain neutral. And sometimes by remaining neutral and not saying anything at all, you are causing more harm than you ever realize.
Yeah. And, you know, I like to give those folks almost an empathetic lens, you know, in that sense, because the periods that we are in are different. It's easy to look back in the 60s and say what you would have done. But these libraries were getting bombed, like dynamite. Bombings were a commonplace. You know, lynchings were still a commonplace. And if you were standing up for the oppressed people, even those white folks would get, that will be the time that you will see a white person being hanged. That's when you will see a white person being harassed, being called nigger lovers and things like that, and being hanged right beside the person that they was trying to stand up for. So it's probably a lot of people who had like a conscious feeling of this isn't right, but a lot of people have families, a lot of people have other things that they have to support and things like that, and it's hard to put that burden on for the revolution, as it were, when the first law of nature is self-preservation. So how do you balance that? I think, so that's why these folks like the freedom librarians and all the other activists and all the other writers and things like that, they should always be honored and respected due to that sacrifice that I don't think we really sit down and really think about. I know a lot of these folks who ended up dying in the 50s and 60s, they probably wanted to live a long life too. I'm pretty sure Martin Luther King wanted to be a grandfather, and Malcolm X wanted to see what his great grandchildren would be like. But to have a love for freedom for not only yourself, not only your immediate family, but for future generations, that's a bravery that I don't think really gets enough attention.
I think I also wanted to hone in, like, as we started to reflect and really had our in-depth conversation, that every form of activism is not for everybody. And that's completely okay. Like, you have to realize some people are great writers. Some people protest, and all the various other forms of activism. I think that's also a point that has to be noted, that every form of activism isn't for everybody. And that's okay, especially during this time period.
Yeah, for sure. I think there was a quote from like Mother Teresa or something like that. It said, if you want to go change the world, go home and love your family. You know what I'm saying? Like, sometimes the best thing you could do is be a great parent and try to steer your children in a way of love and equity and understanding. Because, every adult became that adult through a childhood. You know what I'm saying? So if we can make sure enough children have a childhood of understanding the diversity of humanity, that can only be a win in the long run.
And I think another
That
thing
is
I
one.
kind of
I'm sorry. I was
oh,
chiming in. That's exactly the way I'm raising my children, is trying to have a wider lens and more, it's okay to ask questions, and I feel like that leads to acceptance and discussions, and which sometimes I feel white people, especially in nowadays, are not as, some are not as open to having those conversations, but I'm trying to take the opposite approach.
and I think I also wanted to mention, like, since we're still on our conclusion, that all of this activism was happening at the same time. The Freedom Libraries was not separate to Miss Virginia Lacey Jones and getting her students to write their master's theses. It wasn't separate to any of these editorials and letters. These were happening the same time, the same months. These were happening all together. The sit-ins, everything was happening. Like I said, I really just want to drive home that all of these, everything that we discussed about our library activism through both direct action and literature, was happening all at one time. I know we talked about it as if it was isolated events. However, if you look at that timeline that I produced, and then as we spoke on the Freedom Libraries and the sit-ins, again, just all at one time.
All at one time. Yeah. Well, y'all, I can talk about this all day. I can talk all day and give insight all day, but I know we got to wrap it up. So, again, my name is Christopher Fleming. I was the host this evening. I'd like to thank Anntwanette and Dawn for joining me this evening for a great conversation. And this has been great, and hopefully we can keep it going, and we will see y'all next time.
All right. Take care.